Welcome to the Brown Initiative for Discipleship and Evangelism. My name is Ethan Brown, and this is BIDE. I am producing this podcast in part because I am a partnership student at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, where I'm in the Doctor of Ministry program with an emphasis in outreach and discipleship. The partnership program will allow students like me to graduate tuition debt-free from seminary, and it's because of the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about the partnership program or how you could join my support team, I'll leave a link for that in the description below. Also, if you find BIDE is a useful thing in your life, please feel free to share it with someone else that you think might also believe it's useful. So far, in most of these episodes, my emphasis has been on the outreach portion of my study. I've been thinking an awful lot about evangelism. And I don't intend to stop doing that. I want to continue that focus. But I also am in a program that emphasizes discipleship. The reason for that is because Jesus' method of evangelism, if you really look at Jesus and what he did, his methodology for evangelism was to make disciples. He was willing to talk to very large crowds of people, and he would talk to lots of individual people throughout his work in ministry. Some of them would become his disciples. He would meet Peter and ask him to put out to go fishing and then call him to follow him. Or he would meet Matthew at the tax collector's booth and call him to follow him. And so those guys became part of his inner circle. But not everybody he ever talked to did. He obviously had really good friends named Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He spent time with a guy named Nicodemus, who would eventually, after his resurrection and kind of right at his death, devote his life to him. But throughout his ministry, he didn't become one of the 12. He'd meet the woman at the well, and there's no reason to think that she followed after him. She certainly went and stirred people up for him. But he would even turn away some people. The guy with the legion of demons, he wasn't part of Jesus's inner circle. So the disciple-making work that he did primarily with just 12 guys. Just these 12 persons were brought in to become his disciples. Now, why would he do that? Well, at some point in this series, I'm going to analyze a book by a guy named Robert Coleman called The Master Plan of Evangelism. And it goes into deep detail answering just that question. Why would Jesus focus in on the 12? And the reason is because Jesus knew that to reach the masses, he had to focus on the few. If you want to go really big, you go small. If you want to go big. But are you going to keep the big? Who knows? But if you actually want to have a lasting impact, you don't focus on the masses. The masses prove themselves to be incredibly fickle. It's very easy to change the minds of mass groups of people, and the devotions and the passions of their hearts will really beat hard for something for a while. But if you want to change and transform a life, it calls for intimate life-on-life work that you really do have to become really close. Jesus demonstrated that. The reason he focused in on 12 disciples is because he wanted disciple makers. He wanted to train people to the point where their lives were really, truly changed because they had spent time with him. But his goal was not just those 12. His goal was world conquest. His goal was to become the king of all kings. And so the reason that he focused on the 12 is because he knew that after his His time of visitation here on the earth is done, and he assumes his throne at the Father's right hand and reigns over all the nations. After he begins doing that, those 12 are still going to be here. And those 12 will go out and begin to make disciples, who will then make disciples, who will make disciples. It is through the reproducing nature of discipleship that that the world can be taken over. It's all possible because of what Jesus did with the 12. Well, if we really want to evangelize the world, then we need to not just produce converts. We need to produce disciples. And we need to be thinking in terms of when a disciple is fully formed and completely trained, it's no longer really about them because the disciple has become a disciple maker. That's what Jesus did, and it's because he did that you and I can be Christians. He trained them so they could train others, so they could train others still who would go on to do the same, and so forth. That was Jesus's strategy. And a life that has been trained in the way of Jesus is a life that is really forever changed. A fully mature disciple is not just one who is ethically mature or one that is theologically well-rounded, one that understands the doctrines really well. It's not one that knows the significance and importance of worship and how to engage with it. All of those are about the disciple and their own well-being. And it's not that any of those are trivial, but they're not the goal. A fully formed disciple will be like Jesus, and Jesus, in his heart of hearts, is concerned about others. He didn't come to this world for himself. If Jesus was focused on himself, he never would have come here. This place is broken and full of sinners who he knew good and well were going to kill him when he became incarnate. He knew that. He would not have come here had his life been focused on Jesus. But Jesus' life wasn't focused on Jesus. Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. A disciple who is fully mature, who is fully formed, has taken on that aspect of Jesus' life as well. So that they really do start to see, okay, who I am, I exist not for me, but for the development of people that I can name, people that I care for and I'm in relationship with. And I'm working with those people to help them to grow so that they can become like me, mature in the way that I am, so that they also will live their lives loving other people and will see themselves as mature only when they know that I'm here to help other people grow. Why? Because we're all becoming like Jesus. That was Jesus's vision for discipleship. And if I can, I want to share with you something that has to do with linguistics, and it's something that I'm really excited about. It's a discovery that I made while studying some word groups, and maybe this is me nerding out, I don't know, but I'm just more excited about this than I know how to say. I wanted to study the word mathetes because that is the Greek word that means disciple. And I thought, why don't I look up in some of my more technical tools, why don't I get those out and look at the articles that will help me to understand what that word means, how it was used in the ancient world. I have a book called The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, and I pulled out the volume that would have an article in it on mathetes. But it turns out there isn't an article on mathetes, at least not exclusively. That book will lump together books in word groups that are linguistically related to one another. And the dominant verb is going to be the one that really captures the idea most completely. So the word mathetes, or disciple, that doesn't capture the idea most completely. The word that captures that is manthano. Manthano is the idea of to learn or to become acquainted with or accustomed to. It's about acquiring a skill set, a group of abilities. It involves learning knowledge, but Montano isn't just about the acquisition of knowledge, unless the field you're studying is just about the acquisition of knowledge. So like, for instance, if you have a pagan lawyer, they might pursue Montano of the legal system of Athens. They might want to learn about that, and they'd have a teacher, a didaskalos, who would teach them so that they could gain that information. But mostly, a person who was a disciple, a mathetes, was seeking Montano that would be a little bigger than just the gaining of information. Montano was about learning to practice life a particular way, to become, to gain an understanding of what life really was about, and to acquire skills so that one could live life well. A person who had obtained this kind of learning, that the goal was to become so skilled in this stuff that one could then become independent of one's teacher. So you wanted to gain Montano from your teacher so that you could then become a teacher. Now, ultimately, because it was an honor-based society pretty much across the ancient world, if you had a good teacher who had taught you stuff, you would always be kind of indebted to that person. But there would come a point where the teacher would expect you to be independent. They would expect you to go get disciples of your own, and you would no longer keep connection with that teacher. You would go and acquire your own name, do your own thing. That is the way that discipleship was practiced in the ancient world. So the disciples of philosophers were learning from their particular philosophy school. There'd be a philosopher like Socrates Socrates is a bad example because he did not want disciples, but there were people who thought of themselves that way anyway. But Aristotle, for instance, would gather people who would be his disciples. The goal was not to live forever dependent upon Aristotle, but to obtain such knowledge from Aristotle that one could then go do their own thinking and launch their own school, have disciples of themselves. A rabbi, similarly, would lead someone in and train them up in this Montano practice. They would be a teacher, and this person would be expected to learn. What the person was learning was the rabbi's way, but it wasn't so much the rabbi that mattered. It was the rabbi's way of reading the Torah, the law, the scriptures. So the disciples of a rabbi and the rabbi were all focused on something else. They were all looking together at Torah. And the goal was to obtain knowledge of the scriptures so that you could learn the way that this person read it and get really good at that, to the point where you could be an independent reader eventually. You may still want to give them honor and may still share some of your proceeds with them, but your goal eventually would be to build a discipleship school of your own, where other people would be receiving Montano, they'd be practicing that with you. You would be their didaskalos, you would be their teacher, their master, and they would learn from you until they eventually kind of graduated from your care because they had learned the Torah well enough that they could go do that with somebody else. Now, is that what Jesus was doing? Now, here's the really surprising and kind of cool thing. Montano is not really used much in the New Testament to describe the relationship between the disciples and Jesus. It isn't so much that they came to him as teacher-learner relationship. It's not that they didn't come that way. They would call him teacher, and he would say, "That's what I am." So it wasn't that they weren't to learn from him. It's just that's not where the focus was. And they weren't coming to him so that they could learn some third thing. So there was teacher, disciple, and the third thing that they would study. No, he was the thing that they would study. They weren't just learning his way, they were learning him. They were learning about him and to know him and how to be connected to him. And that connection wasn't temporary. It was expected to be permanent. The call of Jesus was not so much come and practice this learning experience with me, but come, follow me. The word that is most connected to mathetes, to disciple, in the New Testament isn't manthano, it's akalutheo. Now, akalutheo means to get behind somebody, to walk behind them, to follow them. And what Jesus is doing is he's saying, if you're going to be my disciple, then you need to understand that it's a call into relationship with me, and you will walk behind me forever. I don't intend for you to graduate, Jesus would say. And what he expected was for us to come and follow after him. When Jesus sends the 12 out to go make disciples, the idea is not go make disciples that Matthew should leave his presence, Peter should leave his presence, and they should go establish schools of their own, where Matthew is making disciples of Matthew and Peter is making disciples of Peter. It's not the goal. That would have been a goal of a rabbi, but it wouldn't be the goal of Jesus, because what Matthew would do is go and call people to follow Jesus. And just as the original disciples were taught to be connected to Jesus, so when they would go work with others, they would be teaching them, you need to be connected to him. What you need is this Holy Spirit connection to Jesus Christ, and then follow him. The way that I followed him, I could see him, and you're not going to be doing that. You can see me and you can see what he's done, but it's not just about me, and you're not just learning from me. Together, we're going to follow him, and the Holy Spirit's going to help you to become aware of him. You're going to lean into him and learn his existence in your life, because he's a living Lord, and by the Spirit, he's poured out to everyone. He's with everyone who wants to follow him. So what they were sent out to do was not to make their own disciples, but to make disciples of Jesus. Just what had happened to them was going to happen with these other people. And it's going to happen a little bit differently, because Jesus would be in the flesh with the 12 of them, walking around with them, living with them all the time. That isn't how it would be when they were out making disciples. When they were out making disciples, the Holy Spirit had been poured out. Pentecost had come. They were told to wait until that happened, because they really didn't have a mission of their own. They couldn't do it without Jesus being with them. Not only that they couldn't do it without Jesus being with the people that they were leading into discipleship, because they weren't leading them into discipleship to themselves. They were leading them to follow Jesus. The idea wasn't so much learn information, study with me and I'll teach you this other thing, as it was, let me introduce you to someone that you need to know. You need to come along with me as I go behind him. Let's follow him together. And if you need help knowing what it looks like to follow him, then follow me as I follow him. Paul would say that. All of the apostles would say that. They would say, come with me as I follow after Christ. Because discipleship is a learning experience, but it's not merely a learning experience. To be a disciple of Jesus is to learn about Jesus, but it's not just to learn about Jesus. Discipleship with Jesus is different from discipleship as it's practiced anywhere else in the ancient world. And in the modern world, it needs to be like this too, because it is a spiritual connection to Jesus as I follow after him and he leads me in this new way of life. This is why Jesus came. He came to make disciples who would make disciples who would make disciples. But the disciples would never be making disciples of themselves. Always and forever, we point at someone else. All of us who are making disciples, who are disciple makers, I'm never going to make a disciple of Ethan. God forbid I should ever do that. No one needs to learn my ways, because my ways are this mixture of good and bad, beauty and wickedness are all churning up inside of me. But the good that's growing inside of me is growing in me because of the person they need to follow. And I need to lead people to pay attention to him, to focus their eyes on him, to connect spiritually to him, to abide in him, to be with him in prayer and in study and in openness of heart so that they can learn where he's going in their life and learn to get behind him, to follow after him. Because that's what discipleship to Jesus is. And this is why God sent him, to change our lives, rescue us from the brokenness of what we will be without him. Because God so loved the world that he sent Jesus, and Jesus sent us for the honor of Christ and for the life of God.